are not here. So I've been reading the readings, and I think it's very interesting, and we need to keep doing it because it shows very interesting things.
So just I kind of need to clarify. We need to go through the receptiveness, orienting, bracketing, interpretive analysis.
Try as much as possible to follow the phenomenological method, because that way it's easier and
I mean, this is pretty much what we've been doing.
But I think it formalizes and it
definitely
really helps keeping in mind, okay, well, did I actually use the first step, which is receptiveness?
Yeah.
And some of you did not, and it really shows, like, and that's funny because it shows because it's judgmental.
Yeah.
And as soon as you forget that initial step of receptiveness, suddenly your whole reading is judgmental.
Yes.
Where what we're looking for is something that's more observatory. Let's look at what's going on, and then later we can actually discuss values and meanings of the work, and then assess and not judge.
Have more of a scientific judgment more synthesized.
I would say a more highly subjective. Because I think that judgment is not subjective. Judgment is cultural, and it's always extremely contextual. And I can tell that the one who's been the most judgmental, I know there's a problem with the class or something like this. So you feel that it's a reaction to something else than the work of art itself. And respecting receptiveness really allows you to step out that contextual reaction that you may have and say, well, frankly, it's annoying.
Or like, say, for an example, a professor focuses on the quality of a picture of an object rather than the picture of an object itself.
Something like this. And then what I do, I can tell you what I've done with the limited time I had to work with your submissions was to compile them into a text file and to put it through concordance analysis software. So it's a software that analyzes the text really in a stupid mathematical manner. It does the exact same thing that a word cloud would do, but you have access to the back end of it.
And like a text art kind of thing.
Exactly, and you can see how many words were repeated, how many times which one comes first, what's the average context of the repetition of certain words, and that really helps looking at things that are converging. And strangely enough, applying that to I think I had 5 when I compiled this text, I was surprised to see so few words like seeing, watching, feeling, and stuff like that. Where I would have expected that for that kind of reading, that's the kind of term that I would have thought would come most of the time. And it does not. And they show, and they're on this computer, because I could not install it on this one. And they come like they only have 2 occurrences or 3 and stuff like this. So I'm wondering why don't we have more of that? And gaze, for example, is only used twice in the 5 text, and hello, and things like this. So, but I will share with you, and I will send you a link to that software. It's a free thing that you can download. The only problem is that it accepts only plain text.
So you have to .txt file.
.txt is just a plain text. And then once you have that, just looking at the word list is also sometimes very interesting. So let me try to see if I can actually watch it. So for example, let's look at the word list here. So obviously the words coming first are the meaningless words, like I and animation was used 39 times. Forever obviously was used quite a lot. Yeah. But then
sorry, what is this?
it's a concordance analysis software. It's called Conc. It's for the name of the guy who developed the thing, Anthony, and Conc for concordance. So the software, if you just Google Ant, ANTCONC, you will be directed to the home page of this guy. And it's a typical piece of software used in digital humanities. That's a very typical thing in digital humanities. We look at the text and we look at what verb is being used and which one, and you can also look at the context, saying for example watch is always associated with number one eye and then screen maybe, or something like this, and so it allows you to really see things in a huge collection of text that you might not see if you just read them. So that's what I did with the readings that everyone posted. Compiled them into a huge text file and push them throughout. And at first it's like a word cloud that you get, but you can have more details, and that's becoming really interesting. So yeah, and for those who are not in the class, I made this assignment to go ahead, watch one of the Anatole, I forgot his last name, guy. Let's watch one of the text animations, read it and apply the phenomenological method to describe your experience of reading. And we are trying to observe the kind of convergence that we might have in that. So I'm not done compiling things, and I will share with you everything I find, because I think that's interesting. And then I posted something called From Visual Poetry to Cinema. And then, because I was doing that, and then I felt like what is termed poetic cinema is boring. Or there's something to it that I think moves us away from what we had previously defined as poetic. But I had planned to actually watch at historical examples of what's called traditionally in experimental film and in film study what's called poetic cinema, and watch these examples together and then discuss them and then show something else which I think was, and maybe we can discuss that, it was more interesting to me to say, well, let's look at, instead of looking at poetic films, because it's dangerously open, let's rather concentrate on what we could identify as a poetic moment in any given film. And I think, I don't know for you, but for me there's always, in any good film or even a mainstream one, there's always a moment that suddenly sticks out because something unusual is happening. And I've always felt that this is the poetic experience in film. And so I wanted to share that with you and discuss that idea with you. Instead of looking at what's defined as poetic film, let's look at what we define as a poetic experience in cinema. I think it would be richer in terms of, and more in line with what we're trying to do here, which is really looking at poetry from the viewers and listeners' experience instead of looking at formal descriptions. So anyway, let's look at examples of the historical poetic film. So obviously everyone knows this one, or does not. It doesn't
this
matter.
One definitely looks boring. It makes time go by really slow.
So the
I mean, it's cool. It has cool.
Anemic Cinema by Marcel Duchamp.
Was this one the ones at Ultrasound?
Yeah,
First one,
yeah. Yeah.
I was just like watching it. Like, when is it gonna stop?
And
It's hypnotic.
Yeah.
so it's Dada poetry in film. And what's interesting is that I think the relationship to optical illusion I think is interesting, and playing with the thresholds of visual perception. So, and I said that I should read in French bande de gros T pour gros. So, and then that talks about the thresholds. You do not have time to adjust and to actually read and translate, but you only guess that you have symmetrical patterns and you have kinds of palindromes and puns and stuff like this.
Was that supposed to be a recognizable object, or is that something they made just for the? Is it like it's not like a lid or something?
Ok, l'enfant qui tète est un souffleur de chair chaude et n'aime pas le chou-fleur de serre chaude. So you can hear you have chair chaude and serre chaude that are coming back, but it doesn't make sense.
Yes,
Okay.
nonsense.
It doesn't not make sense. It's just playing with the words, and
Oh, okay.
so it's typical Dada poetry, but it has that interesting added dimension, which is really putting yourself as a viewer in a strange position where you have to recompose the message and make an effort. Si je te donne un sou, me donneras-tu paire d'oiseaux, une paire d'oiseaux, une paire de ciseaux. Si je te donne un sou, me donneras-tu une paire de ciseaux? Doesn't mean anything. If I give you a penny, would you give me a pair of scissors? And also, so why is it visual poetry? It's because the text is really. On demande des moustiques domestiques, demi-stock pour la cure d'azote sur la côte d'Azur. So just some kind of playfulness with the sounds. So the text is really visually engaged with the movement and really creating that kind of strange experience for the and nonsensical thing for the viewer. I must say I like them, and I think that's one of my favorite of what is usually comes in the category of poetic cinema. I think it's really pertinent to have that kind of thing here.
Because when you read poetry or when you read something like that and you're going through it, it's almost like skimming something and then you experience it, and you don't have to analyze the poem as such. When you read it, you just feel it.
Yeah.
And you don't have to go into grabbing each word in the poem.
Mm-hmm.
So this is just like that, because you're not able to read the whole thing properly. You're just grabbing few words here and there,
Exactly.
and that itself is the meaning of poetry.
Exactly, and the effort I make to read aloud, meaning translate that into actual words, is really goes against the work of art
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah.
Because you should be trying to do it but failing at doing it, and after a while you just give up, and you let yourself being attracted to the words and the movement on the screen. And
One detail I noticed was that the optical illusions move clockwise, where the words move counterclockwise.
Oh wow.
And words moving counterclockwise is even more unsettling than words moving circularly.
Yeah, you're right.
I mean, when I was watching it, I felt more anxiety because they weren't moving the same way as the optical illusion was. and that the fact that they were going counterclockwise.
But it's easier to read.
It's
right?
easier
Yeah,
to
it's
read,
easier
yeah.
to
Moves
read.
the letters
Yeah.
left to right.
Yeah.
Right to left.
Yeah, because
Because you point your eye at
Yeah,
one
exactly.
point and it keeps coming there.
and that's also what I think is interesting, is that you start questioning your act of seeing, and you say okay, and you design strategies, and it becomes really interactive.
That's going from
Yeah.
left
And I
to
think
right.
that's also what's very interesting, is that you become really fully engaged as a viewer, someone who wants to see, and you need to invent a new
No,
way of
it's going
seeing.
from right to left. Because you see, it's like reading it backwards, counterclockwise.
Yeah.
At least for me, I don't know.
So that's, to me, something that is a good example of poetic cinema. Oula.
So
Oh, that one is not politically correct. I will not read it.
I think a couple of them were not very.
Yeah,
safe
and
for
that
work
one is
kinda
one of
thing.
the
Yeah.
crudest in language.
No, that's moving.
Yeah.
So would you consider like these poetic moments in like cinema, like less poetic films, like to be like visual poetry, or could it be a break in the narrative, or because I was watching the film last night and I happened to look at your post and I was watching Lahain, which I'm sure I said it wrong, but like hate.
Oh yeah.
The hatred, yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The one with the what was the famous actor, the Monica
Vincent
Bellucci's
Cassel.
husband, right?
Huh?
Monica Bellucci's husband.
Yeah, Vincent Cassel.
Vincent.
Yeah.
Yeah, Vincent Cassel.
Yeah. Lion.
Yeah, it's a great film, and
It is. Yeah.
and there's this moment where they're I tried to find a free link to it, but there's only one with a bunch of
Mm.
ads and crazy stuff. But like they're arguing about the police and,
Yeah.
what are you gonna do with that gun? Blah blah blah. This real heavy stuff, and then this guy comes out of the bathroom. He's like, tells this weird story about him, in the Holocaust, getting shipped
Oh
on
yeah.
a train.
On a
and
train, and
my buddy
and-
went to behind a bush and couldn't get back to the train, and goes on for like 3 or 4 minutes, and then they're kind of stunned, and he walks out. What was that all about? And then the film just goes on and never explains what it's about.
That's a very good example. That's exactly
Yeah.
something that qualifies for.
Yeah.
Because suddenly your everything in your perception of the film is changed. Your gaze is changed, and you're looking at the characters on the screen differently. Your expectation about what's going on and what's happening next, suddenly all of that is suspended. So basically, yeah, it feels like whenever the narrative engine pauses
Yeah.
in a film, it opens up to something else. Yeah.
And it
That's
never
true.
reconnects, like there's no, it doesn't weave back into the plot, it doesn't get described later, it never comes back,
Yeah, but it stays
Yeah,
in your memory, and
right.
it
And you're kind of comparing things to this weird story.
exactly, and it tends to kind of echo in whatever is happening
Yeah.
next.
A lot of trains
Yeah.
in the movie.
So let's look at another example of traditionally identified as visual poetry, or sometimes concrete or abstract film. 1920 post-trend, Manhattan, and it's the same vein that you see in Europe, like the Walter Ruttmann, Berlin, Symphony of a Big City, same thing. And it's the same thing with the Dziga Vertov, the man with the moving camera, which is same thing, the story of a city. But here it's using poems from Walt Whitman as intertitles that are superimposed with the film.
fascinating image right there.
Yeah. And here again, here we have something happening in.
They still have the same gates.
I think that shot is probably one of the longest shots you could afford at this time because of
Right.
the length of a reel.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was struck by how many, like, what the landscape looked like, how early in the 20th century, all these big buildings.
There's a rhythm to it.
Huh?
There's a rhythm to it. So
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
walking
It's
by.
like walking. It has its
Yeah.
own stride.
The difficulty with that is the historical aspect of it, and you cannot not watch it as something that is documenting New York in 1920, and that tends to always interfere with your emotion and what you feel. You cannot not do that.
It was interesting too. This is the first time I've watched this since I lived in New York. Like the last time I watched it was before I moved there, and so I find myself also layering on this like, oh, where is that? Like this, like I'm trying to
Yeah.
put myself.
And
Mhm.
the bracketing.
Yeah.
And I think that this documentary like quality in fact keeps us from really experiencing it as a poetic film, which I think is, and I could not find. I had a film from 1919 shot in Venice, Italy, that really had that poetic thing, and you were seeing the car, and it was empty and the boat was arriving and that was it, but it did not have that documentary quality, and I wonder why. You know. You know, it might be, I think that the being stuck with the documentary might come from the sequence of the shots. And when you're moving from one shot to another one, you always feel like there's a story being told and something being narrated and organized.
Yeah.
And it's different. For example, if we were to isolate just one shot and look at this shot, we would not have the same impression. And here that points to something that I think is very interesting, is poeticity in film happens when what is presented to you escapes from the natural temporal sequencing of film. It definitely has to do with the duration of the shot and moving from one shot to another one.
And I think that does not happen when you can't curate such shots. I think it just happens right there, I guess, right? Like you can't think about it. Like even when you're shooting a script that you're doing, the director himself will not know which part will be a poetic moment for which one, because he doesn't know what.
I tend to disagree on that.
Okay.
But so maybe it's random and maybe it's clearly pre-decided and organized. I tend to think it's organized, but
I think this that we're talking about watching it after living in New York. I think this also signifies what is poetic in the movie,
Yeah.
because to me it is documentarian, like kind of documentarian thing, but it's still very poetic because there's no sound.
Oh.
Because that's the most loud city ever,
Yeah.
and you're just seeing pieces of it with no sound. This is it's crazy.
Especially back then with all the steam engines. And
Yeah.
Yes.
Like
Yeah. It must have been.
There's just billowing steam everywhere on this
Yes.
whole thing.
Yeah.
Well, and I wonder if we make the same film and we just replace the shots with contemporary shots of the same subject matter, if it would still watch that way, right? If like the documentary quality that you're mentioning is also just this
kind of constant dynamic rhythm that's coming through the visuals.
but also compounded by the inevitable like historic content.
Yeah.
Of
It's
the,
like if someone was giving a historical voice, that would be totally perfect.
And it's not completely mute, is it? There's like a sort of a white noise to it, or am I just imagining that?
Yeah. But
That's a synesthetic.
Are we really talking about like the narrative and poetic device that is nostalgia? Because there's a difference, I think, between nostalgia and documentary.
yeah.
And I think in experiencing this, you can look at this as a documentary if you haven't experienced it. If you don't have the nostalgia, if you don't have the way to kind of rewind and call back
Yeah.
to call forward on the perception of this. And
Okay.
so I think an interesting aspect of this is that the nostalgia is already built in because of the way the materialism of it.
Yeah.
So it just makes me think of the difference between a documentary and something that's nostalgic.
Yeah.
About this, it's nostalgic for us in a lot of different aspects, but especially because it's obviously not from this time.
Right. That's what.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
So maybe for people, this is the thing of what you just said. For people that were at this time watching that, was that nostalgic or documentary? Yeah. Because for us it's nostalgic.
And because it was a new format at the time.
Right.
What was the nostalgic experience of
Yeah.
this, if it existed?
Well, and this, I mean, this is a foundational City Symphony film, which is folded into the documentary form, which also means that sort of all the films that follow onwards in documentary, whether directly or indirectly, whether they're like drawing from this specifically as inspiration or drawing from films that drew from this as inspiration, like the kind of codes that this laid down or helped to lay down, also echo in modern films, right?
Yeah.
Like, does it watch his documentary in the 1920s, while that idea of that even being a genre that exists is still taking shape, right?
Yeah, because you don't have that preconceived construct of
Yeah.
documentary goes like
Yeah.
this.
Right. Like I watch it and it like my brain drops in the category. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
this is a
Yeah.
watch it like
Yeah.
one of
Like
okay.
somebody turned the volume off, but there's a guy going, in New York City in the 19th
Right. What and the difference between that sort of first shot where we don't know what to expect yet, right? And I think we also had this like collective like, whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then after that, which I think speaks to that point about like sequence.
Yeah.
So we could, I think also, having an understanding that this was an extension of photography, it was kind of like a next iteration of photography. Thinking about the device of nostalgia in both of these contexts, in the context of a film that is a sequence of images, and one image that, kind of like what you were saying before, one image that allows maybe a little bit of more temporal room to like call back, even if you don't have the emotion, even if you don't have the lived experience. I wonder if we were to isolate one image from that film, I wonder if the act of our nostalgia, our lived nostalgia, would be different
Yeah.
as opposed to watching the entire sequence.
Right.
And here the whole mise en scène that is there, that the whole how you fill up the volume and make the viewer experience inside like placing yourself inside the movie. It's amplified because of what she said. There's no sound, so it's almost like blind people. Their senses are amplified with their ears are more active. So
Yeah.
so you feel like you're actually there. So that's
Well,
the
yeah, you
yeah.
can actually hear the sounds that are not presented.
yeah.
Right.
When you see the steam engines, you actually can hear them listening. And
That activity's happening in the brain,
yeah,
making it more immersive.
really, really.
Referent.
But I think it's interesting. We watch it. We're talking about this in Mihai's class, Sean. What is the movie we watch it in his last class?
Intolerance?
Yeah, because there's a whole how to watch this movie thing going on,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
With the what's the name? Lettering.
Intertitles.
the
With
prompting.
intertitles and like
Yeah.
this is how you should be watching, blah blah blah. And this has nothing. So I'm very interested in how people receive that as like an extension of photography. Is photography that moves?
When?
Yeah.
When was this?
1920.
21.
Oh, it's
21.
little.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe people are already literate in.
Yeah,
this.
because
Yeah.
Intolerance since 1916. Yeah.
Well, and that they were making movies like this as soon as like
Right.
Lumiere, right? Like
Yeah.
that's
Yes.
right out of the
Yeah.
gate. They were making like one reelers that were just like
People
one
want
of these shots,
Yes.
basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And what was the compulsion to capture that moment? That
Mhm.
Lumiere, and also in this film too, this humanity that bustles, this thing that grows into the sky that people did.
Well, to me, there's elements of propaganda in
Sure.
all of these. Symphony of the City. It's always an ode to the city and the workers, and always there's in Zika Vertov you have the workers as the new heroes, and here the same thing, that anonymous crowd is.
They
Although-
also juxtapose the mass of people with a graveyard that they're just kind of
Yeah.
trampling over. So there's also kind of like a
Well,
sprawling life.
like
or
them
something.
dwarfing the gravestones, and then them being dwarfed by the towers, and then sort of people vanishing entirely. But there's also a sort of another. I was thinking another layer of. So we watched this. It was in 1920, and that's a different New York. But also, it's enmeshed in a poem that's referencing a different New York, right?
Yeah.
Like Whitman's Manhattan, that is like the 19th century. So there's sort of all these layers. Like that's in 1921. Did it evoke a kind of nostalgia, a different one from the one we experienced? But it didn't make people who would have been familiar with the poem think back then to a Manhattan of
Yeah.
horses and carriages and mechanicals and whatever. And contrast that implicitly with like steamships and towers.
But yeah. But I have difficulties experiencing that as something poetic. Really, for
It's so poetic to me.
is it?
It almost hurts me.
This film.
Uh-huh.
This film.
This film, yeah. Well, maybe because of everything I said, and because I see propaganda, and because I see all of these things.
What propaganda were you seeing in there? Can you help me understand that?
Well, an ode to the glory of the industry and capitalism and all of that.
The workforce.
And progress and
Construction.
all of that power that is represented here.
I think it would have watched, I think, more poetically too without the intertitles, which are that like that remnant of what you're talking about, that like early silent cinema impulse to like almost distrust the ability of the audience to experience a film. That like that this too, like these intertitles too, this use of Whitman's poem is a way to sort of channel, in the same way that they used to use the iris as a device to like channel your visual perception. They would like iris in on like one specific detail in a frame because they didn't trust that you could make that distinction for yourself. The intertitle serves the same purpose with this footage, and I wonder what this footage looks like if we were to just watch that footage laid out end to end with no intertitles whatsoever.
Yeah.
No title, perhaps.
Yeah.
So you said that you think that the poetic in the movie maybe was planned, but in this one we all have so many different poetic experiences or not. So how would that work if it was planned. Does it make any sense what I
No,
I understand.
Sorry.
not to me exactly. So obviously, there's a poetic intention in this film.
said? Okay.
So it was planned to be poetic, and to make sure that it was perceivable, the filmmaker even used a poem to say,
Mhm.
okay,
Okay.
look, I'm talking about something poetic about the grandeur of New York, and I'm saying it's something that is lyrical. So it's a planned poetry, and I'm just suggesting, and I'm saying my reception of that is that it fails at evoking a poetic emotion for me, because I think I read through that poetic intention something else, which is political, which is a statement about the beginning of the 20th century, and something that I think is too naive to actually be poetic. There's no moment where of question in here. It's only assertive. Always and always it keeps repeating the same thing. Look at how great and huge and powerful and all of that. And to me that's why it fails. If it had revealed some weaknesses in that thing, like you have in Tsigavertov, when you're moving from these large movements of crowds to strange close-ups that reveals the mechanical movements and stuff like this, and it would succeed, I think. But here always staying at that level of just seeing the gigantic buildings and stuff like that, and the human beings always having that same size. Always. There's no shot where a human being is something else than a silhouette. You do not have one face in that entire film. And to me that tends to push me away from a poetic experience. But because it suggests one thing, that it's a new kind of landscape, and we should marvel these new kind of landscapes, because it's just like looking at a beautiful forest under the sunset, but it's not.
So there was an assignment for the poetry class a few weeks ago about listening to an audio piece and choosing an image that depicts that. And kind of I put some words to the images that I chose, and going back and and looking at that assignment, that was actually like I wrote my own something. And I think hearing the discussion about the prompting of the poem and how that kind of guides the viewing of this, I realized that probably that was a failure for me to put the words to this image, because instead of letting just the image speak for itself, letting the image do that poetic work. Right. And so I kind of feel like it's a little bit of the aim of what we're talking about here with this.
It feels like what you're saying is like it anchors. It doesn't allow us to relay.
Yeah, exactly. If we look at that would be Roland Barthes' two categories of relationship between text and image, and anchorage and relay.
And I think the only relay that happens is from like your own personal lived experience in New York, and which is still like that.
I mean, I visited, but I didn't feel that.
Yeah, you didn't have that type of.
The interesting relay that happens here is the connection between the industrial city and nature. And the poems always bring back elements of nature, the clouds and the elements and all of that. So that is an interesting relay, because suddenly we read these images in terms of natural or non-natural landscape. That's a relay that the poetic text does, and I think that works well. But
I think it's interesting how subjective like your interpretation is. Like, I I think back, in the Industrial Revolution time, like there was this attitude of, man conquering nature, and it was God's will that man would, come and conquer those elements and bend nature to its will, and that's really not the modern sensibility anymore. We've done that. We've seen the repercussions and we're retreating from it, if anything. And so, like you sitting in that chair in 1920, I don't think you would.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting to me, like there's so many subjective elements. Like, did you live there? Did you see these places? What time did you see this?
Yeah.
And all that, and kind of what Tisha said. The filmmaker couldn't have possibly ever accounted for all those elements.
Yeah.
Completely. I mean, and so even when you're making, like, to him maybe object poetry, it gets broken somehow.
Yeah, and also you're right, and it's a style of poetry. That's probably something that's more typical of the beginning of the 20th century, which is more lyrical, grandiose type of poetry. Yeah, all of that has to be factored in. And maybe, yes, in 1920 could have been a modernist and singing all together and the greatness of that.
I think we can talk about the filmmaker being the architect of a poetic intention, right? Of a poetic, like they can structure it in such a way that it can offer a poetic experience to the viewer, but they can't predict the exact response. In the same way that I, as like a viewer, can, to some extent, also construct by like reconstructing sort of like where I sit, how I view it, right? Like what I surround it with. I can also build for myself a poetic intention, perhaps into a film that didn't originally offer it.
Yeah.
I can think of, the only example I can think of off the top of my head is the like infamous Wizard of Oz, Dark Side of the Moon experience, right? Where like you recontextualize the film and experience it differently, and that works with anything, right? Like almost any movie and any unrelated soundtrack, and you play them together, and it becomes a different experience, right? Watching television on mute with sound or some kind of music in the background, and so I can, construct again, and I don't know what it will necessarily evoke, because again, that's the part where like our own lived experience contacts whatever the objective factors of the material is.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right. But there's also something here that we do not have in the Duchamp, which is suggesting the viewer to adopt another type of watching and changing the strategy of watching, changing the kind of gaze. So here it's all completely equal and it's all completely spectatorial. I'm just receiving the images without any variation of my position as a viewer.
Well, I mean, the other thing is that are you just kind of bored by it because there's not a change of pace and it feels like you're just looking at pictures slowly?
Yeah.
Right. So okay, so me too. But we have to, I think we should remember that if we were to have watched this when it was made, we would be like, wow, like looking at pictures that are moving like that is really kind of fascinating.
The spectacle of it.
Right? Like like the fact that we've had media for 100 years or so since, I don't know, what was the date on this? Like 1920s?
Yeah.
Right? So like almost whatever, close to 100. So, I think our position in time and history is what's, causing us to de-poeticize something that might have seemed more poetic if we had seen it 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the Duchamp piece is just unusual because we don't have a lot of spinning text like that all the time.
Yeah.
Right? Like, whereas this could be a screensaver. And right, and so like when I watch this, for me it feels like a screensaver. Like that's where I sort of put it, and I'm sort of bored by it. And I'm from upstate New York originally, so you'd think I would have that nostalgic for the, but I don't. I'm just like, more.
And that is, I think, very interesting. The historical aspect of technology and our relationship to technology, and how our ways of seeing is transformed by technology. And that's really very interesting. Yeah, before that we barely knew that retinal systems existed, so we had very little acquaintance with that. And seeing this, saying, okay, it's really moving, and probably that moved people to be seeing moving images.
And in a way, it's just as experimental in the sense that I don't know that the theory of montage was as well understood or accepted, right, in like 1921. And so the idea that we'll put these shots together and people will draw whatever meaning they will from the juxtaposition of the shots is also, I mean, we can sort of, I mean, it's unimaginable, right, but like a future, an alternate now in which like the Duchamp stuff becomes the dominant aesthetic, like watching Manhattan would be like just as revolutionary, right? Would be just, you just also wouldn't know what to make of it.
And maybe a good question or a good practice would be, okay, how can we re-poeticize the experience of this film? And that should be considered as I think a valid experiment. How do I recreate some poetic experience out of this? Because that's important, because that would allow us to understand our relationship between our senses and technology, and how we are desensitized somehow by technology that always does two things, which is amplifying the sensitivity of a perception. I can watch microscopic things, but also eliminates tons of other things. So that could be a good exercise, and I will try to do it.
I think it comes back to
Go ahead.
time. Because the reason we're like, I think like Eckstein said, she's kind of bored of it. She's seen it a lot of times. We're also kind of all bored by what would have been the spectacle, but that's true also for things we saw last week. Like last week I saw a drone that does flips or whatever and shoots 4K, but this week there's one that shoots 6K. So like this is just a magnification of like our weariness of new technology. Like we've just gotten 100 years away from this one, and we realize how boring it is in that sense. But that happens immediately, almost. We're always bored with technological trends or spectacles created by new technologies, and so there's nothing really poetic beyond the fact that they can get up high and shoot moving images, really, and then they smacked in some Walt Whitman. It's really kind of it's kind of neat.
Lo-fi.
And
it's really,
low
if you wanna,
it's really cheesy.
like if I did that today and used the fanciest, technology, hopefully everybody would have a similar response. Like, wow, you went up and shot some aerial pictures.
No,
I've never been on top
because
of a
one of the points for those, I mean, as a person that thinks this movie is poetic,
sorry.
I'm sorry saying that because I think it's a personal experience. It's okay.
Of course.
So as a person that thinks this movie is poetic, I think one of the biggest points is it is not from today.
Absolutely, and that's kind of what I'm trying
to
say.
So if you shot today, I'll be like,
yeah, but next week it would lose a little bit, and that's the point I'm trying to make. Is like it's gradually lost, to the point that it creates nostalgia. Even like we've gotten so far away from it,
right,
that it's gone past novelty to nostalgia. And if I did it now, it'd be novelty, and eventually it'd be boring, and then maybe 100 years from now it'd be nostalgia. I don't really know what I'm saying, but
and it's so just to come back to the Whitman in it, right? That like Whitman in Leaves of Grass, like what makes it so remarkable at the time that he wrote it was that it's a story. It's not about like antiquity. It's about like Manhattan right now, the Manhattan that he lives in, the Manhattan that he sees and experiences in a very like embodied way, and that I think maybe regains perhaps in 1921 like a new relevance based on its inclusion in this film, right, and its recontextualization. And regardless, 2016, more than 100 years removed from Whitman, I can read Manhattan and like I feel it, right? Like I still connect to it. And so it's interesting sort of what gets lost, right? Like what falls away in terms of the novelty of we put a camera on a crane, or we put two shots next to each other, or we made photographs move. What's interesting too, like on the flip side of that, is like what endures, right? Like what endures in that. And it's something I think that we can then sort of work into what we do now, because I think I'm guilty of it, becoming enchanted with technology, right? With technological effects. But you're absolutely right that like 3 weeks from now, you know what I mean? That's yesterday's news,
That's old.
Right? 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we were all like DVD, so crisp and clean and wonderful, and now it's like an abandoned technology, basically, right? And so, what endures, right? Like what?
Yeah, exactly.
What endures?
Yeah.
Just kind of playing on that riff a little longer. I think looking at this piece as a video, as an image, and there's a very interesting kind of collision between the intentionality of the Whitman object and the object of the sequence of image that the attempt is to throw them together in kind of like a coherence.
Right.
But what is the function of this piece if it were purely a text-based piece? We were reading the intention of the director, but it is something that is notated in the words, and the words that the director chose instead. So it's almost like reading the shot list,
Yeah,
but like a poetic shot list. So it's written in
That's a great idea.
So, and for me, kind of linking up with Leticia's idea, I see something. I see something poetic in this. Am I really moved by its elasticity to tell like a very resonant story with me? I don't know, but it does reach out and grab some type of something in my lived experience, or something even before I lived in New York, what I believed New York to be, which ultimately was proven totally false when I got there. Because the New York that I thought was there was like from Ghostbusters, which is like how do you live up to that?
So funny.
But I think so. And going back a little bit to anecdotally to the failure of like trying to put words and images together. And this could be a little bit of the kind of the tension or the conflict that you're trying to illuminate by putting text and image, or isolating text from the image, or isolating image from the text. Maybe because there was not a literacy yet, and we saw this a little bit with D.W. Griffith too, of like instructing, framing, as media nerds, like the three of us are, like we know the power of framing. We know that the moving image can tell you something, and it can make you, can't tell you what to think, but it can tell you what to think about, and that's the power. That is the tyranny of that image.
Yeah.
But for me, the function of like the text in isolation and the function of the image in isolation is really what this gets at for me.
Are you away next semester? I can't remember.
No, I will be here.
You will be here?
Yeah.
Do you have your schedule yet? Have you looked?
No.
Like on Galaxy?
No.
I looked yesterday out of curiosity, and I saw a schedule, which might or might not be true.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's how that goes. It seems I'm set to teach a grad class on Wednesday evenings.
Okay.
In this semester, my class is working with Michelle Hanlon's dance class in Starneman's Lit class, and we are working with a Whitman text.
Oh.
Right? And so perhaps next semester, if they're up for it, we could work with this text.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Try to, and I was even thinking we could maybe get performers in Manhattan and do a dual city something.
Yeah.
Right? So
that's great.
if you are interested, we could just make Wednesday night be about this for grad credit for anyone who wants to sign
Yeah,
up, right? Like, just
Yeah.
I don't see why not.
Yeah, no, that's
I'm gonna just throw that out there.
excellent idea. Yeah, great. I think I'm teaching something about virtual reality, sound in virtual reality and virtual environments.
Cool. Is that a
Could be Manhattan.
Sure, why not? I mean, I think
sound.
the more we can kind of conflate
Yeah.
classes to create these richer experiences that are
Yeah,
in dialogue on a multimodal kind of
Yeah,
way
yeah,
is
uh-huh.
the better thing we can offer than
Yeah.
just like.
But I want to really
sorry.
jump back on his thing about suddenly something happens very interesting. I re-poeticize that film when I start to describe everything that I can see in one image. When I go into trying to make an inventory of everything that's present in the image and make a list of words and actions that are taking place, suddenly I have a different relationship with it and I feel a poetic experience in it. Meaning that if I'm tasked to do something, if I task myself to do something with this image instead of just looking at it and really considering the image itself.
Evaluate it.
Yeah. So basically, if I intentionally step out of my spectatorial attitude, I give back value to these images. And just by listening, and I was thinking and doing that mentally, watching back these images and trying to actually name the things that are happening here, the experience is completely different.
Yes.
So we've solved one thing. How to re-poeticize something is by rereading it in a very special way that is carried by a very special intention.
And it changes its context too. I mean, we've
completely.
totally gotten as far away from that kind of documentary.
Yeah, that's a very interesting suggestion.
And also, I think that as the I'm sorry not to cut you off, but
Yeah.
as this media form has evolved, the understanding of the people who make this and the understanding of the function of all the elements that actually go together to make a film has gotten better and has gotten more robust and the ability to manipulate this process that you're talking about.
Yeah, and thank you, because I was guilty reading that film of doing what we are doing today, which is avoiding the images. I think that we are in a culture and in a whole global strategy of avoidance of images. So what I was doing is that I was interpreting something in a context and actually not looking at the images. So I was guilty of doing what I think that we should not be doing. Okay.
But so, like, you kind of remedialized your interpretation or something?
Well, I force myself to actually look at the images for exactly what they are. And instead of applying that filter of my interpretation, which I did, saying it's propaganda. So I did exactly what I'm telling you not to do. and I shut down receptiveness.
Yes, yes. You could be right in saying that it is propaganda. You could be.
Yeah,
Like
but I should not,
Yes.
Well, it is.
It is.
and it is, and I should not orient my reading with that.
Yeah, because propaganda's bad.
Well, and but
encourage
what's
you to close off. That's all, because it anchored.
what's
It
more
didn't allow you to
interesting?
relay,
Oh,
so-
sorry about that.
Go ahead. That's it. That's all.
Well, I think what's more interesting then, I mean, is it or isn't it okay? But like, how is it? How is it and how is it not? Right? And when I drop it in like the box, then I close off the inquiry. It's just a judgment is placed on it, and there's no need to look at it anymore. And I read it specifically through that lens.
There are also some very fundamental qualities that are easy to overlook, such as the fact that we are sort of conceptualizing this as a virtual media object, if you will, that is lacking some of the primary formal components of how it would be viewed. It's not projected, it's not done through a reel. It exists as a virtual frame on a web page, which is a vastly different context to even start with that object.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't occupy volume in light as it reaches that thing. In fact, it's emitted from that directly. We're not in a certain kind of chamber looking at it. There isn't the sound of that thing playing. It's not flickering because of how the screen would, or how the whatever it's projected on would kind of reflect that light back from the projector. So all of that really changes the quality of this thing that we're actually perceiving so completely that it's sort of negligent to consider it the same thing. And I think that kind of has to be brought into how we read or interpret these images.
Yeah, it's a digital version.
Because part of that, both the documentarian and the nostalgic reading is sort of contingent upon seeing that thing in relationship to other things on the screen or within the screen, right? It's sort of become like simulated, or we think of those things as effects because you can apply a Photoshop filter that does something like that. But if you were viewing it or subjected to it in its kind of original format, those things I feel like would feel less like artifice and more either coherent or like inseparable from what that media object is.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there would be much more continuity in our interpretation and more consistency with what people experienced in 1921. So we differentiate ourselves radically by the use of this technology.
Talking about simulation and kind of throwing my first interpretation to the air, 'cause if we're doing this, I think it kind of, and maybe it's because it's digital and not projected, but I think it evokes this nostalgia of things I never had. Very very Disneyland. Like this, what's the name? Main Street?
Yeah, Main Street.
Main Street is the United States that never existed. It kind of evokes what I never lived. I don't know. It's weird. I don't know if that's the definition of nostalgia in English. I don't know, because we have several words in Portuguese for missing stuff. So I don't know.
That's funny because it has the opposite effect on me because it's like I never lived this, so I can't get myself to care about it, to put it harshly. And like you said, if they zoomed into people's like faces and lives, and I don't know, like someone entering a cafe, having a conversation, no sound needed, I think that would emotionally hit me more as a poetic experience.
But that's going back to like a contextual interpretation.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
As opposed to like your evolution or your breakthrough in reading the
the
film.
And I'm sorry for, but at least these sessions are pharmaceutical.
Well, I think
and
everybody's
teaching you
interpretation.
something.
Can I say something about your initial reading, which I agree with your initial reading, but the act of placing a starting point in order for the nostalgia to occur, in order for the interpretation to occur. This place of like, this is a really harsh word to use. This place for where it doesn't matter to you because you never, you don't have anything to connect it with. So like this judgment, right? This judgment of the object. And judgment is a very hard word, and it's a harsh word, but I think that there's something very interesting to the process of understanding whether or not we can be nostalgic about the object. If we could be political about the object, if we could be indifferent about the object, if we could be like bored with the object. So this place of where we start to interpret how we're feeling about the object in conjunction to, or in opposition to, or in combat with what we're actually seeing and what we're actually reading. So it requires a place to start.
Yeah.
Right? And so looking at this and understanding the time where it came from, and then situating your understanding of that time and the object, and situating your perception where you're sitting right now, is a complex mechanism that also people sitting in 2016, we know how to do that very quickly. Or we know what to ignore and what to focus on, or what to like let into ourselves so we can understand what's happening in perhaps a different way than when the film was made. And each of us have a different mechanism of doing this. Right? Like I could read this object, I could read this media object in your way and understand completely what you're saying. But she might not, he might not. But that's actually an important differentiation, because then we talk, then the collision happens of the interpretation. So there's nothing to apologize.
Well, no, but that points to something interesting, which is the real locus for convergence of subjectivities is really the image, the technologically contextualized image as an object, as it stands in front of all of us in that technological context. And that's the only thing that's valid in terms of experience, is what really is there on the screen, and all the rest obviously feeds into this, but it has to reconverge through that place, which is the image itself, because if we do not do that, the image does not exist, and it cannot even be poetic, because it cannot even be. And so maybe that's a question of, that's a question of practice, and I think that so to me, the more we move in here, the more I think that poeticity relies in the activity of the reader much more than anything else. And that constant activity of consciously and consistently going back to the object of the perception is what makes poetry existing. That's just something that is a suggestion, I think. And that's why poetry is a practice. It's not something that is given, it's not a data. It's something that is made up and created by the reader. And that's why it implies literacy, practice, exchange, and all of that. So it's not spontaneous. Well, it's temporary conclusions. But I think, I learned a lot today.
Yeah.
Big data.
So, and we need to shift and move to big data. So, but we will keep working on that next week, and we will be well. Let's look again at more poetic film and poetic moments in film, and let's try not to forget that idea about the going back to the reader and the practice, and so big data. And let's talk about the and maybe we start with this one, the project that we have with Gabriela, which is actually performing Dada song by Francis Poulenc with someone, and I've not found the pianist yet, but we will find one, and it's so easy to play. And maybe Nathan is here and I can show him the score and he will tell me what we can do with that. But the idea is to really deliver that song in a typical cabaret type of setting, like the singer, she's dressed up or something, and the pianist is dressed up, and there's someone to introduce them. with fake names and origins and stuff like this. And then here goes the song. So, and that's a fairly easy and straightforward thing. It will take 5 minutes of the big data moment, and it will be really a surprise, I think, with the range of the other things. And we can decide to place it whenever we want in the entire unfolding of the night. It can be at the beginning, in the middle, or whatever. So we just need time to practice. And then we had the idea of, okay, so why, since we're here singing and doing things live, why should not we go to actually reinterpret another Dada song, which is the Tristan Tzara song called L'Amiral cherche un appartement à louer, which is in French, German and English. So it's 3 voices, and it's primarily text and some sound effects. So maybe we want to do that, and maybe we need 3. Well, Gabriela said she would.
I'll do it too if you need somebody else.
We'll do it too,
Yeah.
and then maybe I will do it.
Great.
So we have 2 performances.
Cool.
2 Dada, strictly historical performances that we can place at any time of the film. And it looks like, okay, I said I would stop diffusing when we talk about